Have you ever met someone who made you feel deeply understood almost immediately, as if they could read you, anticipate you, mirror you, and then, months later, you started questioning your own reactions? That transition doesn't happen by accident. Today, we're breaking down how to recognize the signs and how to respond clearly. Specifically, 7 signs you're dealing with a narcissist, even when, especially when, they seem charming. Let's start with something important. When most people think of a narcissist, they picture someone loud, arrogant, dismissive, easy to spot. But that's not how it usually works. The people who cause the most confusion aren't the ones who are obviously difficult. They're the ones who are warm, engaging, attentive, the ones who seem like exactly what you needed at exactly the right time. That's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. And the reason this pattern is so disorienting is because it starts with something that genuinely feels good. Connection, recognition, the sense that someone really sees you. So by the time the confusion sets in, by the time you start feeling like something is off but you can't quite name it, you're already months in, sometimes years. This video isn't here to tell you what to feel about that. It's here to give you a clearer framework for what to look for and what to do with what you find. Let's get into it. Sign 1. The connection feels unusually fast. Not fast as in a few good conversations. Fast as in, within days or weeks, this person is talking about you like they've known you for years. They tell you you're different, special, that they've never connected with someone quite like this before. It feels like recognition, like finally being seen. And here's why that lands so hard. Because most of us do want to be seen. That's not a flaw. That's human. But what's happening in this pattern isn't genuine discovery. It's a process called love bombing, and it functions as a setup. The intensity isn't about you specifically. It's about creating a level of emotional investment so quickly that you don't have time to assess what's actually in front of you. Think about how due diligence works in any other context. If someone wants to make a major financial decision, they slow down, they examine, they ask questions. Love bombing short-circuits that process. It creates urgency, warmth, and a sense of mutual depth before any of that depth has actually been established. The signal to notice, genuine connection, usually deepens gradually. When it accelerates unusually fast, that pace itself is worth paying attention to. Sign 2. Conversations keep returning to them. This one is subtle because it doesn't always look like someone talking about themselves constantly. Sometimes it looks like someone who's incredibly interested in you, until you notice that the interest is really about them. They ask about your experiences so they can share a bigger one. They ask about your struggles so they can redirect to their own. They're curious about your life, mainly as it relates to theirs. A common version of this: you bring up something difficult you're going through. There's a brief acknowledgement. And then, smoothly, almost seamlessly, the conversation has pivoted to their equivalent situation, which is somehow more intense, more complex, more significant. You walk away feeling like you said something, but also like nothing was actually received. This matters because reciprocal attention is one of the basic mechanics of genuine connection. Not perfectly balanced in every single conversation, but over time, there's a sense of mutual interest. Both people feel heard. When that reciprocity is structurally absent, when you notice that the emotional weight of most conversations flows in one direction, that's a pattern, not a coincidence. Sign 3. Their self-image is unusually rigid. Everyone has a self-concept, a sense of who they are, what they value, how they come across to others. But most people's self-image has some flexibility. They can take feedback. They can acknowledge when they got something wrong. They can update their understanding of a situation when new information comes in. With this pattern, the self-image doesn't flex. There's a version of themselves they need to be, and that version is usually exceptional in some way. The most capable person in the room, the most misunderstood, the one who's been uniquely wronged, the one others simply can't keep up with. Any information that challenges that image gets rejected, not necessarily loudly, sometimes very quietly, but it gets rejected. So if you gently point out an inconsistency, you'll find that somehow the conversation ends with them being right. If you raise a concern about their behavior, you'll find that somehow your concern becomes the problem. This isn't about one disagreement, it's about a pattern in how feedback is processed, or more accurately, how it isn't. Pay attention to whether this person can ever be clearly wrong about something that matters, not in a technical, trivial sense, but in a way that has personal stakes. If the answer is consistently no, that's telling. Sign 4. Rules apply differently to them. Everyone operates with some degree of double standards. That's just human, but what we're describing here is something more structured. In this pattern, there are implicit expectations that apply to everyone around them and don't apply to them. They can cancel plans last minute. You should always be available. They can be short or dismissive when they're stressed. You should manage your tone. They can bring their problems into shared space without much consideration. Your problems should be handled more privately. It doesn't get stated this way, of course. It just operates this way, and here's what makes it hard to track. Each individual instance can be explained. They were tired. It was a hard week. You're being too sensitive about that specific thing. But when you look at the pattern across time, the asymmetry becomes clear. There is a consistent logic that places their comfort, their needs, their preferences at the center, and expects yours to accommodate. The practical test: think about who tends to adjust when there's a conflict between what they want and what you need. If the answer is almost always you, that's worth examining. Sign 5. Accountability keeps getting deflected. This is one of the clearest behavioral signals, and also one of the most frustrating to navigate in real time. When something goes wrong, there's a process most people go through, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes imperfectly, of figuring out their part in it, taking some ownership, acknowledging impact, even if the intent wasn't harmful. In this pattern, that process either doesn't happen or gets reversed. What you'll often see instead, the situation gets reframed so that they didn't actually do the problematic thing, or they did it but had no choice, or they did it but you provoked it, or they did it but you're making too big a deal out of it. Sometimes all 4 of those in the same conversation. There's a specific move worth naming here. It's called DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. When someone is held accountable for a behavior, they deny it, attack the person raising the concern, and then position themselves as the one who's actually been wronged. You come in trying to address something real. You leave somehow defending yourself. If you felt that disorientation, where a serious concern you raised somehow ended with you apologizing, that's not a communication problem. That's deflection working exactly as designed. If this is resonating with you, that's worth noticing. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this, and let me know in the comments what stood out to you. Sign 6. Empathy appears selectively. This one requires some nuance because narcissists, especially those who are high-functioning or have developed strong social skills, can appear very empathetic. They can be warm, perceptive. They can say the right thing at the right moment. They may even be genuinely charming in social situations, reading rooms well and knowing how to make people feel comfortable. But there's a difference between social attunement and actual empathy. Actual empathy means you're affected by someone else's emotional experience. It means their discomfort lands somewhere in you. It creates a pull toward understanding or toward helping, or at minimum toward not making it worse. What you'll observe in this pattern is that empathy appears when it's useful, when it gets them something, when it strengthens their position, when it makes them look a certain way, and disappears when it would cost them something. When you're in distress and need support, they may be largely unavailable, or they make it about them. or they offer a quick solution and move on before you've actually been heard. When someone else is in distress and it gives them an opportunity to play a role, helpful, insightful, the one who knew, they can be remarkably present. The pattern to track isn't whether they can perform empathy. It's whether empathy operates consistently, especially when you're the one who needs it and there's nothing in it for them. Sign 7. You start to feel smaller over time. This last one isn't about a specific behavior. It's about a cumulative effect. And it's often the hardest to identify while you're inside it, because it doesn't happen in a single incident. It happens slowly, incrementally, through small moments of being dismissed or redirected, or made to feel like your perception needs adjusting. You used to be confident in your judgment. Now you second-guess yourself more. You used to express your opinions clearly. Now you phrase things more carefully, more tentatively. You used to know what you wanted. Now you spend more time figuring out what they want and calibrating around that. This isn't the result of one dramatic moment. It's the accumulated weight of a dynamic where your internal experience is consistently treated as secondary. Psychologists sometimes describe this as self-silencing, a gradual process where you start to reduce yourself preemptively because full expression has repeatedly led to friction or dismissal or being made to feel unreasonable. The practical signal here is this: compare who you are when you're around this person to who you are in other contexts, not in a general impressionistic way. Specifically, are you less expressive, less certain? Do you find yourself rehearsing things before you say them, anticipating how they'll land? Do you leave interactions feeling like you need to recover in some way? That shift, if it's consistent and directional, is data. Now let's talk about what not to do, because the instinctive responses often make things harder. The first instinct is usually to explain yourself more clearly. If they could just understand what you're trying to communicate, they'd respond differently. So, you try again, more carefully, more thoroughly. The problem is that the issue isn't comprehension. They understand what you're saying. The issue is that acknowledging it fully would require something they're not able to give. So the conversation doesn't resolve, it just loops. The second instinct is to try to reach the person underneath the behavior, to connect with whatever is driving this, to appeal to their better nature. There's something generous about this instinct, but it keeps you focused on changing them rather than on what you can actually control. The third instinct, and this is subtle, is to make yourself smaller to reduce the friction, to ask for less, to push back less, to just accommodate. This feels like pragmatism in the short term, but over time it compounds, and it's one of the main ways the dynamic described in Sign 7 develops. So what does a clearer response actually look like? It starts with documentation, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. When patterns are consistent, memory gets unreliable. You start to doubt your own perceptions. Writing down specific incidents as they happen, without interpretation, just facts and your experience, gives you something concrete to return to when the self-doubt sets in. It continues with maintaining outside perspective. One of the structural effects of this kind of dynamic is that it tends to become the primary frame through which you interpret your own experience. Other relationships, other feedback, other mirrors, they start to recede. Deliberately keeping those connections active isn't just emotionally helpful, it's perceptual hygiene. It keeps you calibrated to how things actually work in relationships that function differently, and it moves towards setting and holding clear limits, not as ultimatums, not as dramatic confrontations, but as quiet, consistent commitments to what you will and won't participate in. A limit isn't, "You need to stop doing this, or I'll leave." A limit is, "I'm not going to continue this conversation while it's happening this way." The difference matters. One is an attempt to control their behavior. The other is a decision about your own. Let's bring this into sharper focus with something concrete. Imagine a workplace dynamic. Your manager is well regarded, charming in meetings, good at taking credit for team success, and in private, consistently dismissive of your contributions. When you raise a concern about a project, it gets reframed as your misunderstanding. When you succeed, the success becomes part of their narrative. When they make an error, there's always a structural explanation that doesn't involve them. You start adapting, you phrase things differently, you stop raising certain concerns, you do more work to prove yourself, even as the metric for enough keeps shifting. This is a textbook version of signs 3, 4, 5, and 7 operating together. And the reason it's hard to name in real time is because each piece has a plausible explanation. But when you pull back and look at the pattern, the direction of accountability, the flexibility of the self-image, the asymmetry of expectations, the logic becomes clear, and clarity is what creates options. You can't make a real decision about how to navigate a situation until you can see it accurately. Let's look at some of the smaller, more overlooked variations of these signs, because they don't always show up in obvious forms. The accountability deflection in sign 5, for example, doesn't always look like anger or denial. Sometimes it looks like extreme reasonableness. They'll listen carefully, nod, seem to take it in, and then explain, calmly and logically, why the thing you're concerned about isn't actually the issue. The conversation feels productive. You leave thinking maybe you were overreacting. 2 weeks later, the behavior continues unchanged. The selective empathy in sign 6 doesn't always look like coldness. Sometimes it looks like advice. You come with a genuine struggle. They respond with a solution, fast, confident, conclusive. It doesn't quite address what you were feeling, but it addresses something, and you're left with the odd sensation of having been helped and not heard at the same time. The shrinking in sign 7 doesn't always feel like shrinking from the inside. Sometimes it feels like growth, like you're becoming more measured, more careful, more emotionally intelligent. It's only when you check it against external context that you notice you're not more measured in general. You're more measured around this specific person, because full expression has costs there that it doesn't have elsewhere. These variations matter because they're easier to rationalize. They don't set off immediate alarm bells. They just create a low-grade, persistent sense of confusion, a feeling that something is off without a clear incident to point to. Here's something worth sitting with. Recognizing these patterns doesn't require a diagnosis. It doesn't require certainty about someone's internal psychology. It doesn't even require labeling anyone. What it requires is paying attention to how a relationship functions over time, across repeated interactions, and being willing to take that data seriously, not to build a case, not to win an argument, just to see clearly. Because the most disorienting part of these dynamics isn't any single incident. It's the way the dynamic gradually becomes the lens through which you interpret your own experience. You stop asking, is this normal? Because you're inside a frame that has slowly redefined normal. Clear perception is the first thing this kind of dynamic erodes. And clear perception is also the first thing you need to recover. One more distinction worth making, because it comes up. Not everyone with a few of these traits is operating from the same place. People have bad periods, stressful seasons, moments where their worst patterns come forward. A single instance of any of these signs isn't a diagnosis. What we're talking about is consistency, rigidity, the degree to which these patterns hold across time, across circumstances, and specifically in moments where flexibility or accountability would actually cost them something. Anyone can be self-centered under enough pressure. The question is whether accountability, empathy, and reciprocity can come back online when the pressure reduces, or whether they were never really reliably present. That distinction between a person going through something difficult and a structural pattern that doesn't shift is the one that matters for your practical decisions. 7 signs, let's name them cleanly. The connection felt unusually accelerated. Conversations consistently return to them. Their self-image is unusually rigid and defensively held. Rules and expectations apply asymmetrically. Accountability gets reliably deflected. Empathy appears selectively based on utility. You've become smaller over time in this dynamic. These aren't 7 separate problems. They're 7 expressions of a single underlying structure. One that keeps their needs, their image, and their narrative at the center, and treats yours as adjustable. Recognizing that structure is what makes it navigable. Not because recognition fixes anything automatically, but because you can't navigate clearly what you can't see clearly. And that's what this is really about. Not a verdict on someone else, but a clearer view of the situation you're actually in. If you recognized even one of these patterns, don't ignore that. Patterns don't stand out for no reason. Subscribe if you want to keep sharpening your ability to see things clearly, because clarity changes how you move. And in the comments, tell me which of the 7 signs felt most familiar. Not to label anyone, just to be honest with yourself about what you're noticing.